I'm Tom Kennedy, and welcome to Uncensored Stories. Today, we're welcomed by my good friend Sam to talk about the neuroscience behind partisan politics. Thanks for joining us, Sam.
Hey, really excited to be here and to talk about what's a very charged topic, especially at the moment.
For sure, so am I. Why don't we kick things off by you telling us what neuroscience is and what sparked your interest in neuroscience?
Yeah, definitely. So, neuroscience is the study of the biology within the brain, particularly pertaining to how it functions, how it works. It's basically trying to understand how the brain works based on all the interactions that happen in the brain, the functioning of the brain, the cells, all the way down to a cellular level. And for me, what kicked off my interest in neuroscience, I wrote a thesis when I was 15, just turning 16, and the thesis was on how the internet changed our brain. And I remember having a class with my psychology teacher, Tim, and he posed this question. And the question was, what's the internet doing to our brain? And I loved it. So I ran and wrote this big thesis on it and learned all about neuroplasticity. And then ever since then, I've been hooked.
So, what does the internet do to our brain?
So
If you can wrap that up in a short answer.
So I wrote a 15,000 word thesis on it. But basically, it reshapes our brain in this process called cortical remapping and teaches us to be better at short term memory tasks, at flipping between things, but worse at long term memory. So we're learning the more we use the internet, the better we get at multitasking. You can never multitask, but I'll say that in air quotes. And the worse we're getting at like long form reading and long form retention of information.
So, why do you say that we can't ever multitask truly?
The reason is because it's actually called task switching. So imagine in your brain you have like these rules for anytime you're doing anything, and each of these rules is kind of like a tab you've got open in your browser. When you try to do something else, say you go from reading a page on a website to sending a text, your brain has to deactivate that tab that's sending a text, that rule, to move over to the website page and that tab. And every time you do that, the brain actually has to switch between these different networks and activate these different neural networks, which costs energy. And actually, there's a bit of a lag in between. So you're never really doing two things at once. You're just quickly switching between two different things in the brain. And there's a cognitive cost. And so even people who do multitask, every time you switch between, you're effectively using up energy in your brain, and it can be quite draining over a day.
I think your mic is brushing against your jumper a little bit.
Yeah, I have another mic, but it's just a bit unwieldy. So hang on, let me see if I can give this one a whirl. I might just go like this because I thought that might happen.
It's the beard, mate.
Yeah, it's the fucking beard. Oh,
Price to pay for masculinity.
Toxic masculinity. How is
So I
that?
got rid of mine.
Is that better or worse?
That's better.
Sweet. Yeah, well, let's roll.
Awesome, perfect. So on this same topic of the internet and neuroscience, how is social media affecting attention spans, and how does neuroscience come into play to assess that?
That's a super interesting question. I think social media is, if anything, exacerbating the issue with the brain transforming its mass and reallocating resources towards more short-term memory. You think of the speed of social media and how quickly people flick through things. A really interesting thing that happens with social media is because it's so social, and anything social in the brain is really intrinsically very rewarding. We're pro-social creatures, and the brain rewards that kind of information. Anytime you're interacting with people on social media and you're receiving likes or seeing other people's photos, it's really, really highly engaging to the brain. In fact, they did a study on Twitter and found that when people were reading other people's tweets, the reward circuitry in their brain totally lit up the Christmas tree. And so what that kind of means in terms of what we were just talking about with the internet reshaping our brain is social medias are even more addicting and engaging to the brain than regular internet usage. So they're really, really exacerbating that effect, probably more so. And there's a whole host of other psychological implications and flow-on effects of using social media around social comparisons and being able to judge yourself versus a much wider and diverse group of humans than ever before. And there's a whole host of issues that comes with that. But yeah, social media is a very interesting fringe case.
Yeah, and it's very topical at the moment, especially with the social dilemma coming out recently on Netflix.
Yeah,
So
that was
why
crazy.
it was not so surprising though, in some senses.
Yeah.
Why are we getting these rewards in our brains for social acceptance? Why, like you're saying, that it's so everything's we're pro-social creatures. Where does that come from?
It's a survival drive. So you think of everything that the brain does is primarily to survive. And there's kind of a series of questions it asks itself in any situation. And those questions are like, is this going to eat me? Can I eat this? Can I reproduce with it? Am I safe? Those are these like instinctive subcortical under the hood processes that constantly happen. And when it comes to socializing, because we evolved to survive in groups and tribes, we're really, really social creatures. That's our nature as humans and as extensions of primates. Basically, anytime we do anything that is social and pro-social, the brain's reward system lights up because intrinsically there's this process going on that we don't verbalize or vocalize, where the brain is telling itself, due to these signals, I'm more likely to survive because I'm fitting in this social context. It's a survival cue, just like food, water, and sex is to the brain.
Right. And so today we're here to speak about partisan politics, and I
Yep.
think that this links in perfectly, right? So what you're saying about being pro-social creatures, how does that link to nationalism in contemporary society?
That's a huge question, but the big ones around identity, and I'll use the word tribe, even though that's probably not the right terminology for it. But it's this context of people generating an identity that are part of a group, such as in partisan politics, when they choose to be part of the alt left or the right or the conservative or the environmentalists, whatever their political sway may be. By choosing that group and that therefore that identity, that becomes who they then associate with further survival. So that is now a part of themselves. And anytime they are in a context where they're talking through these beliefs or where they're expressing these, especially online, these are now intrinsically part of who they are and how they survive.
Yeah, because I say nationalism, but I think that we've over the last couple of hundred years made a shift from nationalism into this more partisan system. So divisions within the country, and we're especially seeing that in America at the moment. What can you explain the difference between individual psychology and group psychology? So the psychology of thinking in these groups, and namely only two groups now, essentially making these two utopian human being ideals that obviously don't represent two different people, right? So explain how that's happened and why.
We can definitely do that. Let's start at the individual level and then move out to kind of the group, because it gives you a good high level view. So from an individual level, what you'll find, especially when it comes to belief systems, is that when people adopt a certain belief, they then adopt that into their identity. And then once that's part of their identity, you'd say, I'm a nationalist, for example, we then choose to defend that identity as an extension of our physical self, like it's part of our psychological body, because it now represents who we are. And the brain is really almost unable to discern a difference between our physical self and our psychological self. So when it comes to situations of belief clashes, which I know we'll probably get to a little bit later, really, really exciting neuroscience around that. But when it comes to belief clashes or people who are in opposing beliefs meeting with each other, there's this like instinctive threat response, survival response to defend belief systems on an identity and personal level. Then on a more macro level, when you're thinking about big groups of people, one of the strangest things humans do, and everyone does this subconsciously, we don't even realize, is there's this subconscious herding process where we tend to conform to a group. So they've actually run quite a few experiments around conformity and even used fMRI, which is where they scan the brain, and show that when people didn't agree with others in a group, they experienced the parts of the brain responsible for physical pain and social pain, the anterior cingulate cortex, lit up. And basically what that means is, we need to conform in group settings, and our brain is wired that way. So when you think about it in terms of these big overarching groups, and even these national groups or political parties, when we're in these situations as individuals, there is a massive internal pressure in our brain for us to conform to those behaviors. And that's why you can see things like riots. That's why you can see things like protests where people do crazy things. People do really, really crazy things. And that's because their brain's pushing them to conform and fit in with what everyone else is doing in that situation.
Do you think that this is going to change throughout evolution? Do you think that we've evolved too quickly for our own genes? Because you could argue that we're a relatively altruistic world nowadays, that such survivalistic mechanisms aren't necessary anymore. Do you think it's going to go away now that we're not hunter-gatherers anymore over the next however many years?
Such a good question. I definitely think we are quite altruistic on an individual level. I'd say we're quite altruistic, but that it's more complicated when you get to a group level, and that's why there's like the common wisdom around people being better on their own than being in group settings, because we're so influenced by those around us. Are we going to evolve out of it? Possibly. The problem is the evolution of our neurobiology of our brain took almost millions of years, took thousands and thousands of years. And so, as you've said, we've kind of been thrust into this situation where we've advanced so much technologically and societally and culturally, that maybe our brain isn't as adept at keeping up. And I'd argue that's probably one of the biggest contributors to a lot of the political divide in places like America, whereas there's these huge clashes in beliefs, is that people are still so susceptible to being manipulated as a result of their brain. And I think you definitely see this with, certain supporters of certain political parties, is that because they don't really understand how their brain works, they're really, really open to being persuaded, easily persuaded, and then motivated and influenced to action.
Can you talk on confirmation bias?
For sure. Where do you want to start?
What is confirmation bias?
Yeah, we can start with that. So confirmation bias was actually originated as a psychological phenomenon and then was recently confirmed with neuroscience. And it basically states that once you believe something, your brain actively seeks out evidence to confirm that, and will actively try to ignore information that disconfirms that. So you have a bias to confirm what you already know, what you already believe, or what you already think you know. And this is really,
but is that for any piece of information, or a piece of information that you enjoy, that fits your narrative?
It's less so that you enjoy it. It's more that, it's once it's in your narrative. So maybe to give it even better context, what actually happens in confirmation bias is your brain comes up with these like patterns and schemas and kind of maps for how the world works. And so even your political belief is this pattern and schema. And once that's in your brain, there's a part of your brain that actively seeks out information that aligns with this belief to confirm it, to confirm that narrative, to confirm that information. So the part of your brain called the reticular activating system, the RAS, scans your environment and says, yes, look, this is information that says the Republican Party is great, for example. Therefore, I'm going to listen to it. Equally so, there's another part of your brain which is responsible for judging whether or not what someone's saying is correct, how confident you are in saying it's correct. And they've done some really, really interesting, super fascinating studies where they got people in to test confirmation bias. And they had people who disagreed with each other talk, and they found that when someone disagreed with you and then expressed their point of view, this part of your brain, which is responsible for judging, how confident you are in what they're saying, basically totally turns off. So the chance of you listening to what they have to say or believing what they have to say is just eroded almost completely.
That's the RAS.
So the RAS is kind of the information scanner, This part of the brain is actually called the posterior medial frontal cortex for short, or PMFC. And it just, its whole role is to say, oh yeah, what you're saying, Tom, I'm pretty confident that's correct, or what you're saying, Tom, I don't think I'm not as confident that that's correct. And this is all happening basically subcortically, so like under the surface completely.
So is that sort of, in a layman's terms, what makes someone more or less open-minded or closed-minded,
Like
open to opposing views? So what makes someone more closed-minded? We all know people that just don't want to understand or appreciate a conflicting argument.
Convicting argument. I think it's two things. I think it's the exposure to alternative beliefs and other truths. So the more someone has been given experiences which confront their really restrictive beliefs and attitudes, the more they experience different things, different cultures, the more kind of raw material the brain has to be open to new ideas, because it's less likely to be, incredibly secular or religious or what have you in terms of beliefs, due to that broad range of experience. The other one is how strongly tied it is into your identity. And I keep coming back to this identity concept because it's really, really important when it comes to people who have beliefs that they're super proud of, that are, just integral to who they are. I'm talking to people, who are loud and proud about their political parties, and they hoist the flag and they have it on their Facebook profiles. Once you have a really strongly held belief, and it's integral to your identity, people will fight tooth and nail to protect that. And the reason is that that belief then becomes part of their psychological self. And they've done quite a few studies that show where we almost defend our psychological self from ideological attacks as much as we would defend ourselves from physical attacks. Almost the same brain regions activate when under either one of those threats. So when you're talking about people who are just totally unwilling to listen to new information, there's a high chance that they're really strongly rooted in this narrative and this belief they have, and therefore they feel like they're under threat every time that's challenged.
Right. And what are some of those defense mechanisms? So what does the brain do when it feels under threat?
So under threat, you'll see the activation of the survival network, or the threat network, which kind of runs from the insula, from the base of the brain, all the way through the amygdala, which is a lot of people associate with emotion and emotional salience, and then all the way through to the front of the brain. And basically what happens is it triggers this like red alert alarm. And if you imagine this part of your brain, this gatekeeper called Amy, which is your amygdala, is responsible for telling you, when something is potentially really, really scary or dangerous. When you have one of those ideological attacks on your belief systems, she kind of goes, all right, there's something really wrong here, starts to freak out. Your brain will then send a message to your pituitary gland, to your body, to produce cortisol. So you start experiencing stress like you would if you were about to be in a fight, in a physical fight, and you go into that fight, flight, or freeze body state where you feel really stressed. And people know this, right? Like if you strongly believe something and you begin having a conversation with someone, and then they counteract your belief and they say something that you really, really don't agree with, you start to get a little bit mad or tense or angry. And that's just your body's way of saying, hey, this is a threat. And I need to prepare you for this situation.
Yeah. So you talk about fight, flight, or freeze.
Yeah.
How does the fight or flight or freeze theory translate into a non-hunter-gatherer atmosphere when there's no physical violence or interaction, but rather in discourse, for example? So what's going on in the brain when I get a fight or flight reaction or survivalistic impulse, and obviously I'm not going to physically fight or run away? How do people interpret that in terms of their own conversations or actions when they have to adapt to modern society and modern peaceful, relatively, society?
Ooh, another great question. That was a really good one. Well, I mean, it hasn't adapted well, quite simply. It's prepared us really well for physical action, So when we go into that fight, flight, freeze mode, our body's flushed with cortisol and norepinephrine, adrenaline, and a whole host of other hormones preparing us to move. But when it comes from a brain perspective in these conversations, these political discourses between people, what actually happens is the thinking part of your brain that's responsible for all your kind of logic and thinking through arguments and being, let's say, rational, quote unquote rational, the prefrontal cortex resources shift away from that to more of the survival networks, your amygdala, your insula, your hypothalamus, responsible for stress, even your cerebellum and all the other parts of your brain. So you're basically turning down your ability to be rational and logical and to think really clearly with that executive functioning in the front of your brain, and actually turning up your emotional response when you're experiencing this fight, flight slash freeze response. And what that plays out into these conversations is people get, really emotionally aroused, angry, frustrated, really intense, and their ability to think clearly is diminished because that part of their brain is less active during this state of fight, flight, freeze. So it really hasn't translated us well into having, good, honest dialogue between people with incredibly contrasting beliefs, because the brain goes into this like almost shutdown period when you're in fight, flight, freeze, almost shutdown period where it's really, really freaking out. And as a result, some of the things you can say might be, ill conceived, or we're a lot more hot tempered in that state.
That makes a lot of sense. And how much does, from a Freudian perspective, how much does repression play a part in this? So when you go into that fight, flight, freeze mode, a lot of people are, let's say, flight and repressing their emotions, whether that be political or socially charged, whatever that may be. And what are the effects of that repression on the brain
Mm.
and on that person's behavior?
I haven't looked too far into the research or seen much around the research of repression in the fight, flight, or freeze response. So I imagine there might be something there, but I wouldn't want to comment on that, having not seen the research. I do know from kind of an individual standpoint, there is a suppression of other things. So rather than repression of emotion and experiences, there's kind of like a blocking out of all that happens in the brain. So I was talking about that, your prefrontal cortex, the front of your brain where you think, that shuts down when you're in fight, flight, freeze. The other parts of your brain that are also responsible for non-pivotal survival functions kind of go into shutdown as well, because the body and the brain is preparing itself to survive in these situations. And so when you're talking about suppression or repression in the context of Freud as well, well, what's really happening is the brain's just turning off and cutting off anything it feels like it doesn't need to survive. And some of that may be that emotional context, or some of those memories, some of those emotional memories that you refer to, and some of those thinking processes get turned off.
That makes a lot of sense, and it seems like one of the scientific answers for why there isn't really much discourse between these two conflicting and radically polarized groups, which
Yep.
obviously causes a lot of problems. Let's talk about leaders, because obviously that's a major factor in
Yep.
in politics. What do we look for or seek in a leader, whether that's a leader for a country or a tribe? And do different people look for different attributes for their leaders?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I'll see if I can answer that as well as I possibly can. In terms of looking for leaders, one of the biggest things people look for, and we do this intrinsically, without even realizing it, is we look for similarity. We really look for people who we feel represent ourselves, who embody and personify what we believe about ourselves. So you think about, let's use context and a real world example. Think about Donald Trump, who is incredibly polarizing and I would say very persuasive and effective leader for the people who do follow him. His followers, when they see him, see this embodiment and this personification of success, of American values, of the American ideals and dreams, of what they believe in, of who they believe they are. And that's projected out onto who he is. Now, you contrast that with one of his former contemporaries, Obama, who was quite liberal, quite open, the first black president of America, and did an amazing job. The people who voted for him or were persuaded by him and influenced by him saw their same values and their belief systems embodied in him. And so that's probably the big one, is that for people to be able to follow a leader, they need to feel like that leader represents their belief system and their value system so that they can speak for them. And on a neurological level, what really happens, and this is super interesting and really modern research, is that when we listen to a leader speak, when we're listening to Donald speak or Barack speak or any other political leader in the world, if they are saying things that we really agree with and they're sharing stories that we emote with and resonate, if we're resonating with what they're saying, there's a process of speaker listener neural coupling. And what that means is my brain, if I was listening to Barack and I agree with him, my brain would start to look like his. The same areas in my brain would activate as his. So as he was talking, and he was expressing the story about when he grew up, maybe the motor cortex in my brain activates as he's talking about walking home after school. Maybe the emotional parts of my brain responsible for feeling sad when he shares a sad emotion. Whatever it is, they've done multiple studies now in different contexts where they show that the brain of the speaker and the listener, the leader and the audiences can almost synchronize, neural synchronization, to be identical. And you can't even tell who the two people are. And so this really successful speaker-listener neural coupling underlies really, really powerful communication, but also underlies effective leaders, because leaders who are able to really easily convey their message and convey the values and beliefs that their audience has, they'll experience this synchronization of brains, which is, to me, that's incredibly powerful and really, really interesting research too.
For sure, that is very interesting. But is there really just two types of brains? I mean, like this is a very recent thing that we've gone so partisan. If we just take the Democrats and the Republicans, for example, right? I mean, look at the French Revolution in the 18th century. They were Republican and also socialist. So it's like we've come to this. There's such a polarization now that if you say Republican, it's ultra right, it's fascist now, and then if you say socialist, it's communist now. Is there really two, human A and human B, or is this a socially constructed phenomenon? Is there really two different brains, like two different people that, like you say, that when their leader speaks, that lights up that half of the population's brain and the others don't? Or do we have similar attributes to each other? Are we all human, and do we all actually share some very similar views? How much of this should be happening? What's your take on these two groups?
I definitely don't think there's two separate brains, and the research proves that. So all the modern research they're doing now with fMRI, and they're scanning brains, they show that basically no two people have the exact same pattern of brain activity when they experience an emotion, a thought, a feeling, whatever it is, especially with feelings. The research of Dr. Lisa Feldman Barth, basically no two people have the same brain activity for anything. It's similar regions, but will never be the exact same. So I think it's almost impossible to have this idea of two brains for the two parties. And you know this to be true as well, because how many people do you know who fall kind of loosely into either of those categories, but they also hold beliefs and opinions that align with the other side too? I know that personally, I sit probably somewhere in the middle or completely off the map. And I've got lots of friends who are the same. You know, you agree with certain parts of one party and not with other parts. It's definitely
100%.
social though. It's definitely pro-social, right? And that's what a lot of this stuff comes down to, is it's learned. You know, we don't come out the womb with these brains that are Republican or libertarian or nationalist or fascist. Like, there's no babies delivered in a hospital ward and the doctor's going, yes, it's a fascist. Beautiful. That just doesn't happen. What does happen though is over our learned experiences through childhood, through adulthood, and all the exposures we have, especially at home with your parents, who are often your biggest source of political inspiration, for many people. We learn what values and beliefs are important, and then who represents those values and beliefs on a political scale. And that's where our alignment comes into place. And so when it comes to people, their brains matching, and synchronizing up to a leader, it could just be that they personify enough of the beliefs and values that they hold. So it's really interesting. I don't know if it's the optimal system for people, because our brains are all so different. We're so neurobiologically diverse in the way our brains function and interpret the world. To put people in these two buckets, as we do with um, political parties, and having them represent kind of such an undiverse point of view, I think that's probably where we run into so many problems, because you have all these people in the middle.
For sure. Completely agree. How much does, as you said, your upbringing and your childhood and the development of your brain when you're young have to have an impact on your beliefs as an adult?
I'd say it's absolutely, it's everything, right? It's all your beliefs and values come from your learned experiences that you have as a childhood. So those can be in the form of your parents instilling in the values what they believe. As simple as, for me personally, I can't go to anyone's house without bringing something, because my mom always did that when I was growing up, and she always instilled that in me. So that's now integral to who I am. But conversely, also other childhood experiences, even adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, can have a massive impact on your beliefs. If you have a really negative experience with someone from a certain culture, or you have a really negative experience with someone from a certain party, for example, maybe you're a teenager and you're out in the streets and you get harassed by a conservative or a liberal party member, and you think to yourself, oh man, I hate that party, then that now shapes your beliefs and can influence your decisions for the rest of your life. So even little moments, especially really emotionally competent stimuli, really, really emotional events, can totally alter your beliefs for life. And sometimes you won't even realize it. Sometimes though those experiences are then processed, subconsciously under the level of comprehension, but then stored there with the rest of your memories, so that anytime you go to access those beliefs, you trigger that memory and that emotional feeling, and that totally tampers and changes, how you believe and how you express that belief.
So you gave the example of if someone from a political party or social group, you had a bad experience with them as a kid, and then that changes your beliefs from then onwards. And that sort of ties into grudges, right?
Yep.
Somewhat. So what is the neuroscience behind, because I was listening to something recently about how animals don't hold grudges, but humans do. So
Yep.
why do we hold grudges?
I think it's a survival thing is the reason we hold grudges, because we live longer than most animals, and because we are, like I said, really, really pro-social, and we evolved to live in groups. Having the ability to hold a grudge served us from a survival perspective, because if you can hold a grudge, you can remember that the person from that other tribe or that other group that once hurt you or attacked you, that they are no longer your friend, that they're an enemy, and that's someone you should be wary of. Whereas if you didn't have that ability to store that information throughout your life, you might then go and see that person again out on the plain in the savannah, someone from who wasn't from your tribe, and you don't hold this grudge, and they could have attacked you and killed you. So it really served us from an evolution perspective to know who was friend and who was foe from other people. When it comes to the reason we have them and animals don't, I think it's purely because of the way our memory works. We have the most advanced capability for memory out of any animal, almost by far. Only really close with a couple other animals like elephants and certain monkeys. But our ability to store and file information in our brain is incredible. So when it comes to grudges, what we can really do, especially when we have an emotionally arousing event, something that really makes you feel something, as often the start of a grudge is, we are able to hold that for so long in our brain, because anything that's really emotionally arousing and stimulating is stored more strongly as a memory, just because of the fact that the amygdala, which processes a lot of the emotional importance, is right next to the hippocampus, which helps you process memories. So when it comes to grudges, it's the fact that we have these really long-term memories, and that holding grudges and having that information probably would have helped us survive really well as we evolve.
Right. Let's talk marketing. So neuroscience and marketing.
Yep.
How have platforms, massive platforms like Facebook and Instagram, mainly social media, taken advantage of what we're talking about today, the neuroscience behind a pro-social animal, right?
Yeah, we're almost talking a bit of Cambridge Analytica right now.
Yeah, exactly.
There's definitely a bit of that. I think one of the things social platforms have done, which makes them quite scary from a neuroscience and neuromarketing perspective, is they give advertisers or people willing to promote an idea a really, really good, complete picture of someone's beliefs, of someone's values, of the things they're interested in, they like. The richness of the data you can get from Facebook or Instagram, and see what people's activities, what pages they follow, whose content they engage with, and then the ability to serve up these really, really personalized ads is really, really powerful. And the reason for that is because lots of the research into persuasion and neuroscience shows that one of the top factors is to being persuaded is how well we are able to see ourselves in the content, how relatable we feel it is to us, right? So if something we feel, is tailored to our beliefs, our values, um, our lived experiences, it becomes instantly more persuasive. And so in the context of these platforms, when you can serve up ads to someone who's on the fence about voting, and you can target it to their beliefs about gun control, or you can target it to their beliefs about childcare systems, because that's what the data from Facebook's telling you. You can serve them these incredibly powerful, persuasive, emotionally effective ads based on who they are. And that's where I think we're at a really risky tipping point, because as we accumulate and aggregate more of this data and get this really complete psychological profiling, is what they call it, the ability for advertisers and political advertisers to manipulate the mass population with hyper targeted, hyper personalized, hyper relevant ads is everywhere. Like that's a huge risk, I think.
Is it sort of spoiling our brain with content that fits our narrative? So does it make it worse? Do we have a worse reaction when we now get views that are conflicting to what we agree with or what we believe?
So two questions. I don't think it's spoiling our brains so much as that, because of that confirmation bias in our brains, seeking out
Spoiling in the
information
sense
that
of when you spoil a child, like spoiling,
yeah,
like
I guess
giving
you, I
too
guess.
much.
Yep. Cool. That makes sense. Yeah. In terms of that content richness, because our brain has this confirmation bias, when we do see something that agrees with our narrative and our beliefs and our confirmation bias, I think we just latch onto it really, really quickly. So kind of like spoiling a child, what you are doing is you're strengthening the neural pathways associated with that belief by repeating that experience. Every time you experience something, you're activating those brain pathways associated with it. So rather than spoiling the child, it's almost like you're training the child to think that way over and over and over again. And so you think about these strongly held political beliefs, whatever they may be, if they're seeing content that confirms and agrees these beliefs day in, day out, they become more and more and more entrenched into the brain. They become stronger neural pathways that are more easily activated, that therefore become stronger and more deeply held beliefs, which do, I guess, in a way, kind of do spoil the brain, because it makes it much harder then to have a dissenting conversation with someone else, because that belief is just so much more strongly held.
So it becomes harder to unlearn these paths if they're
Absolutely.
the wrong
And
information.
harder to unlearn it, because if you've got something constantly confirming these pathways and these beliefs, then really, like, when you do get exposed to something that disagrees with it, you already have so much information or so many past experiences that do confirm it, that you can just wave that off. And that's really what confirmation bias is. Your brain going, oh no, that doesn't make sense to me. Because think about all the times I saw this ad, this ad, this ad, or this piece of content, this belief. Therefore, the other information is invalid.
Right. And this whole conversation of social media sort of ties into public shaming. So why do we get rewarded for public shaming? It seems very popular now in our society to publicly shame people.
Ooh, that's a really great question. I think a lot of it comes down to that concept of virtue signaling, which is like part of that identity piece there, where, you know, people like to public shame others because it's a way to promote their values and their beliefs. Like often when you think of like the term social justice warriors and other people who are really big into the public shaming behaviors, they're doing it to promote what they believe, to kind of signify to the rest of the world and especially those around them, hey, you know, this is what I stand for and this is where I'm at. And as a result, they're able to, you know, promote their identity, which is what it's really about. It's a complex one. I actually haven't seen too much of the research around public shaming and why we do it, but I would venture to say that the biggest trigger is people wanting to promote who they are and their identity, and also to fit into the tribe and fit into the herd. Think about public shaming.
For me, it seems to be a social acceptance
thing. Yeah,
people desiring to be accepted by a social group.
You know what, I could actually totally agree with that. I think there's a massive herding effect with it, especially when you see like the bandwagons. Like so many people jump on the public shaming bandwagon to bash or talk down to or shame a certain public person for whatever they did, because it then allows them to be part of that community too. So it does really ties into that pro social attitude.
It seems like there's a lack of empathy as well for the person that's being shamed, which sort of is relevant to what you're talking about, this confirmation bias, that because that person has a conflicting view, it doesn't matter so much because you're promoting your narrative.
Yeah, totally. I think that's 100% the case. It's also people underestimate the power of the group, right? And what I mean by that is they did this in experiment where they got a group of participants to line up, and then they gave them these questions. And what they didn't know that was there was only one person in the group who was actually a study participant. The others were volunteers, so they were in on the job, right? And they would ask the question to the group, and the volunteers who were in on the job would give the wrong answer. Then when it came to the person who was actually being studied, the participant, they would feel so much overwhelming pressure that they would also give the wrong answer, even if they knew it was right. So they'd be like, what's the capital of France? And all the people who were in on the study would be like, oh, it's New York. When it came to the volunteer or the participant who was being studied, they would feel like they had to say New York. And that's because in their brain, there's this like mechanism that says fit in, conform, fit in, because otherwise you won't survive. And it comes to things like public shaming. You have that same mechanism come into play, but on an intellectual and an ideological level, where people would feel like, oh, I gotta say I believe in this. I gotta say I believe in this. I'm lacking empathy because I have to fit into this group and into this narrative.
Right. Thanks, mate. Finally, tell us about your podcast.
Hey, so I host a podcast called Brain Tools, where we talk about, surprise, surprise, the brain. We call it, you know, practical brain science for everyday people. We try not to use too many technical terms, layman's terms, and we always wrap up with 6 practical things you can do to, you know, improve your sleep, communication, emotional regulation. We're actually doing a couple episodes on emotion and emotional regulation at the moment. You can find that on iTunes, Spotify, or Podbean. And you can also find me on LinkedIn, where I post.
It's a fantastic podcast, mate. I really enjoy it. It's very informative and comprehensive for complicated topics, but you make it very understandable for laymen like myself.
Thanks, man. Appreciate that. It's always great to get that feedback. Yeah, we're just super passionate about the brain. Find it very interesting.
As do I. Thanks, Sam. Make sure to follow the Rocky Road Post on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Thanks again, mate.
Thanks, mate, for having me. So good to be here.
No worries. Anytime.